Welcome to the Momnificent Podcast. This is the place where we help parents live a happy, healthy life with their kids. We're going to show you how to connect with your child and help them even in their most difficult moments as we hear from experts in the field. I'm your host, Dr. Karin Jakubowski, an international speaker, public school principal, and former struggling student. The Momnificent Podcast equips parents with science-based strategies to help you live a happy, healthy life with your kids. Welcome. Well, I'm excited to have David Preston back on our show with us. We started this incredible interview on our last episode, and it was so good, but we ran out of time, and so we had to cut it short and come back live. So, David, thank you so much again for popping back on another call to finish our episode. We were having so much fun. Thanks again for joining me.
It's my pleasure, Karin. Thank you for having me.
So, David, okay, here's the next question. How can students incorporate this into their curriculum on their own, if not through their traditional schools? And then for those of you who might be popping on to this episode, we're talking about open source learning, which is a very cool framework that David has worked with through and has done with kids and is currently working with kids. So maybe bring, in a nutshell, people up to speed if they're listening to this episode first by any chance, and then maybe how students can incorporate that into their curriculum if their school isn't kind of providing this in a way.
Yeah, so I think in a lot of ways, this is an easier question than we imagine because learning is just what we do. And schooling or education, that gets into a lot of formal structures and organizational structures and commodified products and publishers and testers and oh my. So if we just take a pause on all that other stuff and think about how we operate in the world and make sense of it and our place in it, we're learning all the time. And sometimes that looks like it's formal. We might join a course or we might enroll in a school. A lot of the time, that's just tinkering and figuring something out or stubbing our toe on something and remembering that that's there, so we should go a different way. Now, in the 40s and 50s, William Skinner famously, or B.F. Skinner, I should say, famously did the whole operant conditioning and classical conditioning. And that has a bad rap because it's been so oversimplified and it's usually used in command and control style environments. But you can have the most pedantic, strict, unforgiving education system. I can go into a class where I'm taking pick the most intimidating course in the back of your mind and the least tolerant teacher delivering it. Well, if I take that information and I process it online somewhere, I start a blog, I tweet about it in threads, I make something goofy out of it and put it on Pinterest. I can do anything I want. And as long as I'm sharing those artifacts and getting feedback on it, in the old days when I went to UCLA, we would have a study group that met outside of class. Well, half the time there was beer and bad humor involved, but it was a way of processing outside the scope of what the professor offered formally. So when I say open source learning, the temptation, and a long way back around to where I started, the temptation is to think of it as, oh, I need to buy a book and do these steps and have this neatly colored chart, and it's supposed to follow this pattern. Not really. I can certainly help anyone, whether they're an individual or they're an educator in a formal environment, design an open source learning academy model for one kid, a classroom, or a school. But it also can happen from the individual's perspective backward. And by backward, I mean, normally we're thinking about the authority in the front of the room as the forward-facing source of all of the information and the rules of order that go along with the classroom environment. But in open source learning, you can take any wild hair thought you have and curate that and use it both to document your own thought process and your own learning exploration. But you can also do that in such a way that it provides value to other people who are thinking about either similar things or maybe just in your circles who happen upon your artifacts and go, "Woo, this is kind of interesting. That kind of goes with what I was thinking." And now you're in a whole different conversation. So I get self-conscious because all of this is very abstract, right? So the question becomes, well, all right, David, then how do I actually do this? Well, step number one is have an interesting thought. Step number two is put it where other people can see it. And step number three, start a conversation by asking, hey, what do you think? Now, if that person cares about you, or they're a peer, or better yet, if they're someone with experience and some mentorship capability, those conversations start something that I then don't pretend to predict, but it's going to lead someplace interesting, and it can align with everything from personal growth goals to transcripts and graduation credits for graduation.
So how could a student use it if their school doesn't do this sort of process opportunity?
Right. So right now, if someone is listening to this recording or watching wherever you place it, I'm not going to know. You're not going to know, but they'll know. And they might have a wild hair about, this could work with my parent group, or this could work in a class that I'm teaching, or I've always wanted to change careers, and I'm wondering if this is a way that I could actually create a portfolio, build my skills while I'm sharing, and then use in addition to my resume to maybe land the job that I've been thinking about. And as soon as that person decides, A, they're interested in a way that's not being offered, B, they want to think out loud in a space that's both potentially synchronous and asynchronous. And by that, I mean, when we put things on a blog or on a static site and get comments, we're not in the room with the people at the time. So if a student's in the classroom, period 2 algebra, in that moment, it's probably not going to be kosher for them just to start conversations with people around them. So the synchronous part has to wait. And asynchronously, if they're on their phone, or if that's not okay, then maybe during the passing period or at lunch or sometime later in the day, maybe they take pictures with their notes and they put those online and they ask someone for feedback. Maybe they find a math professor and go, hey, is my algebra teacher doing this right even? All of those kinds of conversations, and this is where the open and open source learning comes from, used to be impossible. We used to have to rely on the teacher and the curriculum in the room at that moment because we simply didn't have any other choice. And our memories were the only carrying system we had besides whatever assignments we completed. But the assignments we completed were only for an audience of one person. The teacher would grade those assignments, make a critical comment or two, and then we would take those, crumple them up in our binder or our backpack someplace, and that would be it. They'd be lost to history. Open source learning involves expanding our network to other people, or even in reflection over time to our older, wiser selves in a week or two, once we've had a chance to practice with the material more, so that we can then get more eyes on it, get more perspectives about it, maybe influence it with another discipline or two, and see what comes up.
That's really cool. Because as you're talking now, it's helping me even see it and understand it even more, even though you and I have talked about this for several times for several months now. And it's where I was leaning towards was kids who are bored in school and giving them this opportunity to pursue and learn something that interests them, because they all have to get through the school part anyway. But maybe if they were also doing something that interested them, that would keep them there or keep them wanting to come back. Or maybe the parent whose kid does think school's boring, maybe this is something they could do with them, in addition to their schooling, to drive and foster that love of learning, where maybe we hope they all get it in school, but maybe school isn't doing it for them. So that's kind of where my head's gone in this area in the last month that we've been talking. But in addition, what you just shared just kind of gave it another spin for me to think about it. So yeah.
Well, it's kind of a wonderful thing because whenever you have a commodified process or product, at some point you're going to have to say, no, that's not what this does. And that's simply not true for open source learning, which again can make it seem abstract, like it doesn't have boundaries. But consider this. Buddhism is a wonderful thought system because it can peacefully coexist ideologically with everything else. And a friend who can always say yes is always a valued resource. So I like to tell people you don't have to be sick to get better. And let's just keep this to students in schools for the moment. A student who is thriving can use open source learning to curate a portfolio and present that to prospective employers, admissions officers, scholarship judges, prospective mentors, etc. But you're absolutely right. Students with all sorts of needs, whether it's special education, whether it's disciplinary, whether it's just a very difficult relationship with school and authority, whatever the situation is, I have not found a person yet who can't benefit from a little bit more freedom, a little bit more curiosity, and a little bit more inductive reasoning. In other words, instead of saying, well, Karin, you need algebra 2, so we're going to sign you up for this course and get you these credits. That's deductive reasoning, right? I know where the end point is, and so we're going to work backward to get you there. Well, if you're really interested in, I don't know, crocheting or skateboarding or astrophysics or whatever the thing, eventually it's going to require some sort of math, and eventually it's going to require some sort of history, and eventually I'm going to get you to algebra if that's the thing on your transcript that needs to be gotten. So it's really not as complicated as it sounds. The thing that makes it sound more complicated is that our culture has moved so far to telling teachers and administrators what they cannot do that it feels like, oh my gosh, where's this coming from? But when you think about how we actually learn, it's our native language.
And I like the whole kind of inquiry based learning approach to it, where like they're following a question that they come up with that they want to learn about, and there's power and ownership and control there. And a lot of times kids go to school and we tell them what they're supposed to do and how they're supposed to do it, and I just love that whole creative aspect that it provides kids and the power of choice and ownership. That's what I see and get excited about for those kids.
Yeah. I mean, who wants to be Dilbert instead of your favorite entrepreneur? Nobody wants to be told what to do all day long by people who seem to know less than they think they do.
Especially when you get a bright kid who kind of like knows a lot of what is already being taught like that. Yeah, yeah. So my heart goes out to them. Not that it's yeah, my heart goes out to a lot of kids at a lot of different places in their career. Those who struggle with their behavior, or the kids who struggle to get it done, or the kids who struggle to get through those, like we had talked about earlier, the boring moments, because we all have them. And so here's another question. It takes a while to change a habit, like we all know. Is there resistance to open learning or open source learning that you have seen and experienced in schools, or whether it be parents or students right now that you've had experience with? And what was like that? What was that like for you?
Yeah. So, well, we live in the United States in 2022. I think there's resistance to everything. And I think in a way that's healthy, partly because I can't control it, so I may as well work with it, but also because I really do think that education, for all of its challenges, you've got some of the most passionate people on the planet in these conversations. We care about our kids. We want to see them have safe, nurturing environments. We want to see them have uh, positive outcomes in terms of their mental and physical health. We want to see them have bright futures. Everybody cares about this stuff. Most of the people who care, well, they care more than they know. And that's no fault of their own. But if we're going to hold out education as a profession of some kind, and we're going to talk about theoretical frameworks or research-based, validatable outcomes and all of this, well, then we need to preserve a role for that in these conversations. So when a parent says, "Hey, I don't want somebody saying gay in a Florida classroom," um, that's adorable, but it's also a bunch of steaming pile of crap that I'm going to debunk. And I can be very hard on issues and very soft on people. So in my own practice of open source learning, I started by teaching it in parallel with whatever course content was necessary for keeping the standardization gods happy. So we'd have, whether it was an ELD or all the way up through AP curriculum that was totally defensible against the most inane bureaucrat you can imagine by design, because my life's too short to deal with that stuff. But at the same time, if you can't tell, I'm also kind of a happy idiot who likes to run around breaking stuff and being creative. So in order to make that defensible, we also had, over time, we developed things like collaborative working groups, big questions, the ability for students to say no if I proposed an idea or propose something better. And it's less about taking on, anybody who's ever read Sun Tzu's The Art of War, I did when I was in college, you can't take on the standing army. Education as an institution and a force of nature in our culture it's this amazing combination of robustness and imperfection. Like, you cannot find, and I tried when I was in graduate school, you cannot find an era in American history when anyone collectively said, wow, school, you're just crushing it. Thank you for making everyone's lives better. It just didn't happen. And so you would think, with everyone complaining about this literally every year for the last 400 years since the old Satan Deluder Act in Massachusetts,
that something would be different.
But it doesn't happen.
By now.
And that's because of what I alluded to earlier. I call it this intergenerational Stockholm syndrome. The people who run the zoo are the people who won the zoo, is how I think of it. Because in order to get a job as a teacher or an administrator, especially as you move up through the ranks into like district administration, you have to know how to play that game. And so the people who were good at it in the first place are the most likely to come in and replicate it. That's not a knock on good people doing hard work to try and help other people. I love everybody. This is not, I don't want to be co-opted into that kind of a monkey poop fight at the zoo thing here. But at the same time, what we have as a result is, rather than taking on the standing army of a 400-year-old institution that is not going to change on our watch, we also have the opportunities that have been handed to us by the internet, the most dramatic communications revelation in human history, which we still do not have our minds around as a culture because there is no awareness building campaign, much less a curriculum. So we have technology, we've got the tools for the job. We have been given a horribly cruel gift with the pandemic, because in closing campuses, we've been forced into conversations about alternatives that maybe we wouldn't have wanted to have otherwise. But because we now have confronted issues like equity, social justice, technology and capitalism's encroachment into what we should think of as a public good, and a lot of other issues along with that, we now have some flexibility in how we practice. And in the end, rather than looking at it as a monolithic institution, I see school as a collection of people. The word university is short for a Latin phrase that means community of masters and scholars. And so for me, even if I'm working with a 6-year-old, one of us knows stuff, and usually both of us knows stuff. And if we're talking, now we're in community, and let's see where that conversation takes us.
I love that. So how long do you think it will take till open source learning is the main method of learning in our education system? Do you think we'll even get to that point?
Yeah, I figure about 5-10 minutes.
I'm signing up. I'm signing up my school.
Well, what's exciting to me is that,
What?
so when people talk about systems and brands and all this kind of stuff,
Yeah.
I'm really not interested in that.
Why?
I'm here talking to you, and I do this stuff on a regular basis because anybody who touches it, anybody who gives it the name or who thinks about it in a term that leads them to the kind of conversation you described before we went live with the young person who was finding their way, and all of a sudden it occurred to you to ask that question. Well, we build community in those moments, and it's what people are more naturally inclined to do in the first place. So my goal, rather than impose this or sell it or persuade people, this is purely pull-based. Every single time I've talked with someone who tries any of the elements of open source learning with integrity, if they're not already doing it in their own practice, because a lot of people are, A lot of people ask questions of learners instead of tell them. A lot of people express kindness and generosity and flexibility in the way that they teach and learn. But when people do this, the result is invariably positive. I have never, nor could I even ever conceive of someone, and maybe you could tell me an example because I've been in this for so long. Can you imagine someone saying, hey, what do you really care about?
Right.
And how can I help you get better at that or understand it? And having them think, oh, this sucks, or not be gratified when, I was just talking to a teacher before we started this interview, and it's a story like all of us in education have. A young man who at 12 years old, because one parent was convicted of a murder he committed, and the other parent brought in a step parent who was also a meth addict and beat him to an inch of his life. At 12 years old, decided, I'm either going to kill myself or I'm going to make it so that no one can kill me. And that's when he jumped into the gang and moved all the way up to shot collar. And it took conversations like, you can call it whatever you want, restorative dialogue, safe spaces, just genuine empathy. But it took this teacher just simply asking what happened repeatedly and waiting to learn that about him so that they could find something that this kid cared about enough to maybe dip his toe back in the water of trusting, of hoping, of envisioning any sort of a life other than the nasty, brutish, and short experience he'd had to that point. And now he's, working for Tesla and making more than the teacher.
Wow. And it's like, so you mentioned that story we talked offline before we started recording, and I'll just share a brief part of it. So I overheard this kid talking at lunch about dreading going back and having to do his writing for that period of the day. And just because we had talked, it just really literally popped into my head, and I just asked him, like, what do you really want to learn about? Like, if there's something you had time to look up, what would you research, study, learn? And he said to meet a gamer, someone who created video games. So I was like, well, do you know somebody? And he's like, well, they're only on YouTube. And I'm like, well, we can find them. We can reach out to them. They have an email, they have a contact. They probably have a link or a website. And it was so funny because he just looked at me like I had two heads, like, yeah, right. Like, we don't have his email. We don't have his contact. I'm like, but we could probably find it. What if we found it? Can you think of a question you would ask him? And all of a sudden it was like his whole perspective changed, and I just used the example of get through your boring moment of writing, if that's boring for you, because we all have boring moments in life and we have to get through them. But let's do that, and then let's focus on something that you do love and enjoy that will keep his attention. And then that's the part that I was thinking in my head, not saying that to him. And it was so exciting. Like, it was awesome. I loved it. So, like, even something as simple as that.
And when I think about the connectedness, so I'm working with a continuation school learning community right now, and so all the stigmas aside, a lot of the students in this program were actually ranked in the top few of their classes and did not want to go back to the traditional campus, even though authorities said it was safe, because their parents were worried about either it may not have even been COVID. Some cases it was bullying, some cases it was social anxiety, or just watching other people not take their education seriously and wanting to be in a more tailored environment. But the reason I bring it up is because one of the students I was just talking to this morning um, didn't have an easy experience at a comprehensive high school site. And it was for the exact same reason as your young person. And he wound up doing the exact same thing once we started talking. He's now halfway to developing a video game and teaching me stuff that I don't understand. But the world, if you've ever watched Jane McGonigal's TED Talks, the world of gaming is so intricate and interdisciplinary. You could literally just make that the course of study and everybody could bite off the pieces that they wanted to chew. So I'm really happy to hear that.
It's just opening up your mind to think differently about what we always do and have done and really kind of expect. And so that's why I love talking to you, because I do feel like our education system like needs something different. It needs a change. And yeah, there have been changes, and yes, things are shifting and changing. But like, I think there's a way we can get all kids excited about their learning that I don't always see, whether they're a struggling learner, a fragile learner, coming from a fragile environment into the school, or like that kid is talented and gifted and struggles with the mundane things that we have to just get through because those are the things we get through. And so I think that's what inspires me the most when I talk to you is this, it just like takes the ceiling off of what could be. And that excites me. And the reason why I am a principal is because I love kids, but even more than that, I want them to love coming to school. And so I am thinking of ways. And if they're not enjoying it, then I'm like, wait, how could we make this enjoy? What can I do? What leadership opportunity, even maybe even if it's that, to get you to come to school every day, even if you have to just get through what you're supposed to get through to get to the next level. Not that that's, and some people could argue that, but I'm always looking for something that pulls a kid in. And I think that's why when you were sharing it got me so excited.
Well, and so one of the things I love about talking with you is both of us get going and we talk really fast and we cover a lot of territory and we make very difficult things sound fairly easy. But even in that last couple of sentences, there are assumptions that are implicit that I'm not so sure we should still be taking for granted. So, assumption number one is that we should be thinking about a way to pull in learners that they haven't thought of. And that's why instead of building for people, I like to build with them. And I don't care how old they are, I don't care if they're 6 or 60. It starts with a question. Why are you here? What do you want? What are you interested in? And the question may be different depending on the circumstance. If I'm talking to a group of executives or a classroom full of students or a room full of moms and dads, it doesn't really matter. What matters is the humanity of being curious and not feeling totally responsible or on the hook to have all the answers. Mm. I think that's a real challenge for educators because we're trained that way. And, unfortunately, some people's personalities naturally gravitate toward that kind of thinking. For me, I'm a huge fan of knowing what we don't know. And one thing that I never know, none of us can, is who the people are who show up on the first day of class. We are a tiny part of their lived experience. So who would be so presumptuous as to imagine that I have all the answers and this is what you should learn? I have a pretty good idea of what I think is important, and I have a pretty good idea of how I think our neuronal architecture and memories and cognition and all of that good stuff works. At least I've read the stuff. But to know you and to know what would be the best optimal situation for you, that's not territory I'm ready to go into unless we've had some sort of a conversation and you've let me in enough to help me understand. Yeah. The other thing that you mentioned was, for a lot of educators, the idea that we need to get through something in order to get the good stuff. Well, our country was founded on the Protestant, puritanical work ethic, and I understand that we derive a lot of our sense of self from trial, especially when it comes to work. One of my favorite books in the last 20 years was Bullshit Jobs by David Graeber. And don't be mad at me, that's the actual title. And we come to this awareness somewhere along the line, just because it's so prevalent in our culture, that work is something we have to suffer through. And that every kid who, washes dishes faster in the restaurant so he can enjoy his time with his buddies, then has to stare down a manager who somehow figures that I didn't hire you for the task. I don't own you just for the job that you're here to do, but I own your time. And that, the Carnegie seat hour and the kinds of thinking that we've adopted along the way, drip by drip in school life, that's really a problem for me. One of my favorite things is talking about remote work, and whether that's in organizations or it's in schools. When did we stop trusting anyone to do anything if we weren't eyeballing them? You have all of these algorithmic biased, I'll name a couple, Proctorio, or even some of the stuff that Google and Microsoft and Apple and Pearson are rolling out. It's very disturbing, the assumption that left to our own devices, we would somehow naturally do the wrong thing.
You have to be constantly monitored.
Right. And I understand that kind of view of human nature serves political interests, but it definitely does not serve learning interests. It serves being taught and keeping people in line and penalizing them for stuff, but that's not the business that I'm in. Yeah. So, I caught those things along the way, and I'm picking on them not because you were wrong at all. I think you're saying what most people think and feel because that's the way we were taught. Mm. But wouldn't it have been wonderful if we could have been learning instead? And that's what I'm trying to recover at this point.
Mm. So powerful. Well, David, again, thank you for your time. I will have to have you back on because I just absolutely love every time we get the opportunity to talk. And it like I said, it just takes the lid off of like our thinking and what I face and experience and every day in our education system, and always looking for ways to help our kids just really love and learn and thrive, which is what we want them to do actually at the end of the day anyway. So how can someone find and follow you?
Well, that last point you made is what I say to all of my groups of learners whenever they leave, because at some point there's going to be a Wednesday when I'm not around. And that's the point when we're going to learn exactly what happened here. So my real hope, and thanks again for having me on and for doing what you do, because putting these conversations out into places where people can see and hear them is a huge help. Even if it's just for me today, because I always enjoy talking to you. So to follow up on that, the moment where this becomes real for your listeners is where they take some action. So please feel free to drop me a line. You can email me personally at david@davidpreston.net. That is my website, davidpreston.net. We are starting an open source learning community-based website for people to share their stories and to get ideas from one another. I'll be looking forward to that soon. And you can also follow me on Twitter if you're interested in that kind of thing at Preston Learning.
Awesome. Thanks again, David. Appreciate you.
Thank you so much, Karen. It was good to see you again.
Hey there, it's Karen. I hope that you're enjoying the show. And by the way, if you're a mom who wants to learn how to help your child when they're struggling behaviorally or facing challenges in school, get started today by getting my free short video course, 3 Steps to Happy Healthy Kids, at www.educationalimpactacademy.com/free video. If you're new here or you haven't done this yet, this is definitely the first step to get started in learning how to have a happy, healthy life with your kids. So head on over to www.educationalimpactacademy.com/free video and grab your free gift today. Well, that's all we've got for this episode of the Momnificent Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, I would be honored if you would subscribe and rate if you really liked it. I know wherever you're listening right now, it might not be the best time to leave a comment, but feel free to leave a question, a review, or a comment at any time. And until next time, remember, don't worry, be happy.